Elements of Harmony by Aristoxenus, translated by Henry Macron, published by the Clarendon Press, 1902. Book 1. The branch of study which bears the name of harmonic is to be regarded as one of the several divisions or special sciences embraced by the general science that concerns itself with melody. Among these special sciences, harmonic occupies a primary and fundamental position. Its subject matter consists of the fundamental principles, all that relates to the theory of scales and keys, and this, once mastered, our knowledge of the science fulfills every just requirement, because it is in such a mastery that its aim consists. In advancing to the profounder speculations which confront us when scales and keys are enlisted in the service of poetry, we pass from the study under consideration to the all-embracing science of music, of which harmonic is but one part among many. The possession of this greater science constitutes the musician. The early students of harmonic contented themselves, as a matter of fact, with being students of harmonic in the literal sense of the term, for they investigated the enharmonic scale alone, without devoting any consideration to the other genera. This may be inferred from the fact that the tables of scales presented by them are always of enharmonic scales, never in one solitary instance of diatonic or chromatic, and that too, although these very tables in which they confine themselves to the enumeration of enharmonic octave scales, nevertheless exhibited a complete system of musical intervals. Nor is this the sole mark of their imperfect treatment. In addition to ignoring diatonic and chromatic scales, they did not even attempt to observe the various magnitudes and figures in the enharmonic as well as in other genera, confining themselves to what is but the third part of that complete system. They selected for exclusive treatment a single magnitude in that third part, namely, the octave. Again, their mode of treating even branches of study to which they did apply themselves was imperfect. This has been clearly illustrated in a former work in which we examined the views put forward by the students of harmonic, but it will be brought into a still clearer light by an enumeration of the various subdivisions of the science and a description of the sphere of each. We shall find that they have been in part ignored, in part inadequately treated, and while substantiating our accusations, we shall at the same time acquire a general conception of the nature of our subject. The preliminary step towards a scientific investigation of music is to adjust our different notions of change of voice, meaning thereby change in the position of the voice. Of this there are more forms than one, as it is found both in speaking and in singing, for in each of these there is a high and a low, and a change that results in the contrast of high and low is a change of position. Yet although this movement between high and low of the voice in speaking differs specifically from the same movement in singing, no authority has hitherto supplied a careful determination of the difference, and that, despite the fact that without such a determination, the definition of a note becomes a task very difficult of accomplishment. Yet we are bound to accomplish it with some degree of accuracy, if we wish to avoid the blunder of Lausus and some of the school of Epigonus who attribute breath to notes. A careful definition will ensure us increased correctness in discussing many of the problems which will afterwards encounter us. Furthermore, it is essential to a clear comprehension of these points that we differentiate distinctly between tension and relaxation, height and depth, and pitch, conceptions not as yet adequately discussed, but either ignored or confused. This done, we shall then be confronted by the question whether distance on the line of pitch can be indefinitely extended or diminished, and if so, from what point of view. Our next task will be a discussion of intervals in general, followed by a classification of them according to every principle of division which they admit, after which our attention will be engaged by a consideration of the scale in general, and a presentation of the various natural classes of scale. We must then indicate in outline the nature of a musical melody. Musical, because of melody, there are several kinds, and tuneful melody. That which is employed in musical expression is only one class among many, and as the method by which one is led to a true conception of this latter involves the differentiation of it from the other kinds of melody. It will scarcely be possible to avoid touching on these other kinds to some extent at least. When we have thus defined musical melody as far as it can be done by a general outline before the consideration of details, we must divide the general classes, breaking it up into as many species as it may appear to contain. After this division, we must consider the nature and origin of continuity or consecution in scales. Our next point will be to set forth the difference of the musical genera, which manifests itself in the variable notes, as well as to give an account of the loci of variation of these variable notes. Hitherto these questions have been absolutely ignored, and in dealing with them we shall be compelled to break new ground, as there is in existence no previous treatment of them worth mentioning. Intervals first, simple and then compound, will next occupy our attention. In dealing with compound intervals, which, as a matter of fact, are in a sense scales as well, we shall find it necessary to make some remarks on the synthesis of simple intervals. Most students of harmonic, as we perceived in a previous work, have failed even to notice that a treatment of this subject was required. Aristoxenus and his school have contented themselves with remarking that there are two possible melodic progressions starting from the interval of the fourth, both upwards and downwards. They do not definitely state whether the law holds good from whatever interval of the fourth the melody starts. They assign no reason for their law. They do not inquire how other intervals are synthesized, whether there is a fixed principle that determines the synthesis of any given interval with any other, and under what circumstances scales do and do not arise from the syntheses, or whether this matter is incapable of determination. On these points we find no statements made by any writer with or without demonstration, the result being that although as a matter of fact there is a marvelous orderliness in the constitution of melody, music has yet been condemned, through the fault of those who have meddled with the subject, as failing into the opposite's defect. The truth is that of all the objects to which the five senses apply, not one other is characterized by an orderliness so extensive and so perfect. Abundant evidence from this statement will be forthcoming throughout our investigation of our subject. To the enumeration of the parts of which we must now return. Our presentation of the various methods in which simple intervals may be collocated will be followed by a discussion of the resulting scales, including the perfect scale, in which we will deduce the number and character of the scales from the intervals, and will exhibit the several magnitudes of scales as well as the different figures, collocations, and positions possible in each magnitude. Our aim being that no principle of concrete melody, whether magnitude or figure or collocation or position, shall lack demonstration. This part of our study has been left untouched by all our predecessors with the exception of Aristoxenus, who attempted a partial enumeration without demonstration. How worthless his statements are, and how completely he failed even in perception of the facts, we have already dwelt upon, when this very subject was the matter of our inquiry. As we then observed, all the scales, with the exception of one, have been completely passed over. And of that one scale, Aristoxenus merely endeavored to enumerate the figures of one magnitude, namely the octave, empirically determining their number without any attempt at demonstration, by the recurrence of the intervals. He failed to observe that unless there be previous demonstration of the figures of the fifth and fourth, as well as of the laws of their melodious collocation, such an empirical process will give us not 7 figures, but many multiples of 7. Further discussion here is rendered unnecessary by our previous demonstration of these facts, and we may now resume our sketch of the divisions of our subject. When the scales in each genus have been enumerated in accordance with the several variations just mentioned, we must blend the scales and repeat the process of enumeration. The necessity for this investigation has escaped most students, nay, they have not so much as mastered the true conception of blending. Notes from the next subject for inquiry, inasmuch as intervals do not suffice for the determination. Again, every scale when sung or played is located in a certain region of the voice, and although this location induces no difference in the scale regarded in itself, it imparts to the melody employing that scale no common, nay, rather perhaps its most striking characteristic. Hence, he would deal with the science before us must treat of the region of the voice, in general and in detail so far as is reasonable. In other words, so far as the nature of the scales themselves prescribes. And in dealing with the affinity between scales and regions of the voice, and with keys, we must not follow the harmonists in their endeavor at compression, but aim rather at the intermodulation of scales, by considering in what keys the various scales must be set so to admit of intermodulation. We have shown in a previous work that, though as a matter of fact some of the harmonists have touched on this branch of our subject in a purely accidental way, in connection with their endeavor to exhibit a close-packed scheme of scales, yet there has been no general treatment of it by a single writer belonging to this school. This position of our subject may broadly be described as the part of the science of modulation concerned with melody. We have now set forth the nature and number of the parts of harmonic. Any investigations that would carry us further must, as we remarked at the outset, be regarded as belonging to a more advanced science, postponing accordingly to the proper occasion the consideration of these, their number, and their several natures. It now devolves upon us to give an account of the primary science itself. Our first problem consists in ascertaining the various species of motion. Every voice is capable of change of position, and this change may be either continuous or by intervals. In continuous change of position, the voice seems to the senses to traverse a certain space in such a manner that it does not become stationary at any point, not even at the extremities of its progress. Such at least is the evidence of our sense perception, but passes on into silence with unbroken continuity. In the other species which we designate motion by intervals, the process seems to be of exactly the opposite nature. The voice, in its progress, stations itself at a certain pitch, and then again at another, pursuing this process continuously, that is, in time. As it leaps the distances contained between the successive points of pitch while it is stationary at, and produces sounds upon, the points themselves. It is said to sing only the latter and to move by intervals. Both these descriptions must of course be regarded in the light of sensuous cognition. Whether voice can really move or not, and whether it can become stationary at a given point of pitch, are questions beyond the scope of the present inquiry, which does not demand the raising of this problem. For, whatever the answer may be, it does not affect the distinction between the melodious motion of the voice and its other motions. Disregarding all such difficulties, we describe the motion of the voice as continuous when it moves in such a way as to seem to the ear not to be stationary at any point of pitch. But when the reverse is the case, when the voice seems to the ear first to come to a standstill on a point of pitch, then to leap over a certain space, and having done so, to come to a standstill on a second point, and to repeat this alternating process continuously, the motion of the voice under these circumstances we describe as motion by intervals. Continuous motion we call the motion of speech, as in speaking the voice moves without ever seeming to come to a standstill. The reverse is the case with the other motion, which we designate by intervals, in that the voice does seem to become stationary, and when employing this motion, one is always said not to speak, but to sing. Hence, in ordinary conversation we avoid bringing the voice to a standstill, unless occasionally forced by strong feeling to resort to such a motion, whereas in singing we act in precisely the opposite way, avoiding continuous motion and making the voice become, as far as possible, absolutely stationary. The more we succeed in rendering each of our voice utterances, one, stationary and identical, the more correct does the singing appear to the ear. To conclude, enough has been said to show that there are two species of the voice's motion, and that one is continuous and employed in speaking, while one proceeds by intervals and is employed in singing. It is evident that the voice must, in singing, produce the tensions and relaxations inaudibly, and that the points of pitch alone must be audibly enunciated. This is clear from the fact that the voice must pass imperceptibly through the compass of the interval which it traverses in ascending or descending, while the notes that bound the intervals must be audible and stationary. Hence it is needful to discuss tension and relaxation, and in addition, height and depth of pitch, and finally, pitch in general. Tension is the continuous transition of the voice from a lower position to a higher. Relaxation, that from a higher to a lower. Height of pitch is the result of tension. Depth, the result of relaxation. On a superficial consideration of these questions, it might appear surprising that we distinguish four phenomena here instead of two, and in fact, it is usual to identify height of pitch with tension and depth of pitch with relaxation. Hence, we may perhaps with advantage observe that the usual view implies a confusion of thought. In doing so, we must endeavor to understand, by observing the phenomenon itself, what precisely takes place when in tuning we tighten a string or relax it. All who possess even a slight acquaintance with instruments are aware that in producing tension, we raise the string to a higher pitch, and that, in relaxing it, we lower its pitch. Now, while we are thus raising the pitch of the string, it is obvious that the height of the pitch, which is to result from the process, cannot yet be in existence. Height of pitch will only result when the string becomes stationary and ceases to change, after having been brought by the process of tension to the point of pitch required. In other words, when the tension has ceased and no longer exists. For it is impossible that a string should be at the same moment in motion and at rest. And as we have seen, tension takes place when the string is in motion, height of pitch when it is quiescent and stationary. The same remarks will apply to relaxation and depth of pitch, except that these are concerned with change in the opposite direction and its results. It is evident, then, that relaxation and depth of pitch, tension and height of pitch must not be identified, but stand to one another in the relation of cause and effect. It remains to show that the term pitch also connotes a quite distinct conception. By the term pitch, we mean to indicate a certain persistence, as it were, or stationary position of the voice. And let us not be alarmed by the theory which reduces notes to motions and asserts sounds in general to be a motion, as though our definition involved the proposition that under certain circumstances, motion will, instead of moving, be stationary and at rest. The definition of pitch as a certain condition of motion, call it equability or identity, or by any more enlightening term you can find, will not affect our position. We shall nonetheless describe the voice as stationary when our senses assure us that it is neither ascending nor descending, simply fixing on this term as descriptive of such a state of the voice without any further implications. To proceed then, the voice appears to act thus in singing. It moves in making an interval. It is stationary on the note. Now, if we use the term motion and say the voice moves, in cases where, according to the physical theory, it undergoes a change in the rate of motion, and if, again, we use the term rest and say the voice rests, in cases where this change in the rate of motion has ceased and the motion has become uniform, our musical theory is not thereby affected, for it is plain enough that the term motion, in the physical sense, covers both motion and rest, in the sense in which we employ them. Sufficient has been said on this point here. Elsewhere, it has been treated more fully and clearly. To resume, it now being clear that pitch is distinct from tension or relaxation, the former being, as we say, a rest of the voice, the latter, as we have seen, motions, our next task is to understand that it is distinct from the remaining phenomena of height and depth of pitch. Now, our previous observations have shown that the voice is, as a matter of fact, in a state of rest after a transition to height or depth. Yet the following considerations will make it clear that pitch, though a rest of the voice, is a phenomenon distinct from both. We must understand that for the voice to be stationary means it's remaining at one pitch, and this will happen equally whether it becomes stationary at a high pitch or a low. If pitch, then, be met in high notes as well as low notes, and the voice, as we have shown, must of necessity be capable of becoming stationary on both alike, it follows that, inasmuch as height and depth are absolutely incompatible, pitch, which is a phenomenon common to both, must be distinct from one and the other alike. Enough has now been said to show that pitch, height, and depth of pitch, and tension and relaxation of pitch are five conceptions which do not admit of any identification inter se. The next point for our consideration is whether distance on the line of pitch admits of infinite extension or diminution. There is no difficulty in seeing that if we refer solely to musical sounds, such infinite extension and diminution are impossible. For every musical instrument and for every human voice, there is a maximum compass which they cannot exceed, and a minimum interval less than which they cannot produce. No organ of sound can indefinitely enlarge its range or indefinitely reduce its intervals. In both cases, it reaches a limit. Each of these limits must be determined by a reference to that which produces the sound and to that which discriminates it, the voice, namely, and the ear. What the voice cannot produce and the ear cannot discriminate must be excluded from the available and practically possible range of musical sound. In the progress in parvitatem, the voice and the ear seem to fail at the same point. The voice cannot differentiate, nor can the ear discriminate any interval smaller than the smallest diesis, so as to determine what fraction it is of a diesis or of any other of the known intervals. In the progress in magnitudinem, the power of the ear may perhaps be considered to stretch beyond that of the voice, though to no very great distance. In any case, whether we are to assume the same limit for voice and ear in both directions, or whether we are to suppose it to be the same in the progress in parvitatem, but different in the progress in magnitudinem, the fact remains that there is a maximum and minimum limit of distance on the line of pitch, either common to voice and ear or peculiar to each. It is clear then that distance of high and low on the line of pitch, regarded in relation to voice and ear, is incapable of infinite extension or infinitesimal diminution. Whether, regarding the constitution of melody in the abstract, we are bound to admit such an infinite progress is a question demanding a different method of reasoning not required for our present purpose, and we shall accordingly reserve its discussion for a later occasion. The question of distance on the line of pitch being disposed of, we shall proceed to define a note. Briefly, it is the incidence of the voice upon one point of pitch. Whenever the voice is heard to remain stationary on one pitch, we have a note qualified to take place in a melody. An interval, on the other hand, is a distance bounded by two notes which have not the same pitch. For roughly speaking, an interval is a difference between points of pitch, a space potentially admitting notes higher than the lower of the 2 points of pitch which bound the interval, and lower than the higher of them. A difference between points of pitch depends on degrees of tension. A scale, again, is to be regarded as the compound of 2 or more intervals. Here, we would ask our hearers to receive these definitions in the right spirit, not with jealous scrutiny of the degree of their exactness. We would ask him to aid us with his intelligent sympathy and to consider our definition sufficiently instructive when it puts him in the way of understanding the thing defined. To supply a definition which affords an unexceptionable and exhaustive analysis is a difficult task in the case of all fundamental motions, and by no means least difficult in the case of the note, the interval, and the scale. We must now endeavor to classify first intervals and then scales according to all those principles of division that are of practical use. The first classification of intervals distinguishes them by their compass. The second regards them as concordant or discordant. The third as simple or compound. The fourth divides them according to the musical genus. The fifth as rational or irrational. As all other classifications are of no practical use, let us disregard them for the present. In scales will be found, with one exception, all the distinctions which we have met in intervals. It is obvious that scales may differ both in compass and owing to the fact that the notes bounding that compass may be either concordant or discordant. The third, however, of the distinctions mentioned in the case of intervals cannot exist in the case of scales. Evidently, we cannot have simple and compound scales, at least not in the same way as we have simple and compound intervals. The fourth distinction, that according to genera, must also exist in the case of scales, some of them being diatonic, some chromatic, and some enharmonic. It is obvious that they also admit that the fifth principle of division, some are bounded by a rational and some by an irrational interval. To these four there must be added 3 other classifications. First, there is that into the conjunct scales, the disjunct scales, and the scales that are a combination of both. Every scale, provided it is of a certain compass, becomes either conjunct or disjunct, or else combines both these qualities, for cases are to be seen where the latter process takes place. There is, secondly, the division into transilient and continuous, every scale belonging to one category or the other, and finally, that into single, double, and multiple, as all without exception admit of classification under these heads. An explanation of each of these terms will be given in the sequel. Starting from these definitions and classifications, we must seek to indicate and outline the nature of melody. We have already observed that here the motion of the voice must be by intervals. Herein then lies the distinction between the melody of music and of speech, for there is also a kind of melody in speech which depends upon the accent of words, as the voice in speaking rises and sinks by natural law. Again, melody which accords with the laws of harmony is not constituted by intervals and notes alone. Collocation upon a definite principle is also indispensable, it being obvious that intervals and notes are equally constituents of melody which violates the laws of harmony. It follows that the most important and significant factor in the right constitution of melody is the principle of collocation in general, as well as its special laws. We see then that musical melody differs from the melody of speech, on the one hand, in employing motion by intervals, and, from faulty melody, on the other hand, melody which violates the laws of harmony by the different manner in which it collocates the simple intervals. What this manner is will be shown in the sequel. For the present, it will suffice to insist on the fact that, though melody which accords with the laws of harmony admits of many variations in collocating the intervals, there is yet one invariable attribute that can be predicted of every such melody, of so great importance that with its removal the harmony disappears. A full explanation will be given in the course of the treatise. For the present, we content ourselves with this definition of musical melody in contradistinction to the other species. But it must be understood that we have supplied a mere outline without as yet reviewing the details. Our next step will be to enumerate the genera into which melody in general may be divided. These are apparently 3 in number. Any melody we take that is harmonized on one principle is diatonic, or chromatic, or enharmonic. Of these genera, the diatonic must be granted be the first and the oldest, inasmuch as mankind lights upon it before the others. The chromatic comes next. The enharmonic is the third and most recondite, and it is only at a late stage, and with great labor and difficulty, that the ear becomes accustomed to it. We shall now return to the second of the distinctions and intervals previously enumerated, and shall proceed to examine one of the 2 classes there contrasted. These classes consist, as was remarked, of concords and discords, and it is the former that we shall now take for consideration. We shall endeavor to establish the facts with regards to one of the many points in which concord differs, namely, respect of compass. The nature of melody in the abstract determines which concord has the least compass. Though many smaller intervals than the fourth occur in melody, they are, without exception, discords. But while the least concordant interval is thus determined, we find no similar determination for the greatest. For as far, at any rate, as the nature of melody in the abstract is concerned, concords seem capable of infinite extension just as much as discords. If we add to an octave any chord, whether greater than, equal to, or less than an octave, the sum is a concord. From this point of view, then, there is no maximum concord. If, however, we regard our practical capacities, in other words, the capacities of the human voice and of instruments, there is apparently such a maximum, and the interval, namely, composed of 2 octaves and a fifth. The compass of 3 octaves is, as a matter of fact, beyond our reach. We must, of course, determine the compass of the maximum concord by the pitch and limits of some one instrument. For doubtless we shall find an interval greater than the above-mentioned 3 octaves between the highest note of the soprano clarinet and the lowest note of the bass clarinet, and again, between the highest note of a clarinet player performing with the speaker open and the lowest note of a clarinet player performing with the speaker closed. A similar relation, too, would be found to exist between the voices of a child and a man. It is indeed from cases such as these that we come to know the large concords, for it is from different voices of different ages and instruments of different measurements that we have learned that the interval of 3 octaves, of 4 octaves, and even greater intervals than these are concordant. Our conclusion then is that, while the smallest concord is given by the nature of abstract melody, the greatest is only determined by our capabilities. That the concordant intervals are 8 in number will be readily admitted. The determination of the interval of a tone is our next task. A tone is the difference in compass between the first 2 concords, and may be divided by the 3 lowest denominators, as melody admits of half tones, thirds, of tones and quarter tones, while undeniably rejecting any interval less than these. Let us designate the smallest of these intervals the smallest enharmonic diaces, the next the smallest chromatic diaces, and the greatest a semitone. Let us now set ourselves to consider the origin and nature of the differences of the genera. Our attention must be directed to the smallest of the concords, that of which the compass is usually occupied by 4 notes, whence its ancient name. Now, since in such an interval the notes may be arranged in many different orders, what order are we to choose for consideration? One in which the fixed notes and the notes that change with the variation in genus are equal in number. An example of the order required will be found in the interval between the messe and the hypate. Here, while the 2 intermediate notes vary, the 2 extremes are left unchanged by genus variation. Let this then be granted. Further, while there are several groups of notes which fill this scheme of the fourth, each distinguished by its own special nomenclature, there is one which, as being more familiar than any other to the student of music, may be selected as that wherein we shall consider how variation of genus makes its appearance. It consists of the messe, licanus, paripate, and hypate. That variation of genus arises through the raising and lowering of the movable notes is obvious, but the locus of the variation of these notes requires discussion. The locus of the variation of the licanus is a tone, for this note is never nearer the messe than the interval of a tone, and never further from it than the interval of 2 tones. The lesser of these extreme intervals is recognized as legitimate by those who have grasped the principle of the diatonic genus, and those who had not yet mastered it can be led by particular instances to the same admission. That greater of these extreme intervals, on the one hand, finds no universal acceptance, but the reason for this must be postponed to the sequel. That there is a style of composition which demands a licanus at a distance of 2 tones from the messe, and that, far from being contemptible, it is perhaps the noblest of all the styles, this is a truth which is indeed far from patent to most musical students of today, though it would become so if they were led to the apprehension of it by the aid of concrete examples. But to anyone who possesses an adequate acquaintance with the first and second styles of ancient music, it is an indisputable truth. Theorists who are only familiar with the style of composition now in vogue naturally exclude the 2-tone licanus, and the prevailing tendency being to the use of the higher licani. The ground of this fashion lies in the perpetual striving after sweetness, attested by the fact that time and attention are mostly devoted to chromatic music, and that, when the enharmonic is introduced, it is approximated to the chromatic, while the ethical character of the music suffers a corresponding deflection. Without carrying this line of thought any further, we shall assume the locus of the licanus to be a tone, and that of the paripatae to be the smallest diaces, as the latter note is never nearer to the hypatae than a diaces, and never further from it than a semitone. For the loci do not overlap. Their point of contact serves as a limit to both of them. The point of pitch upon which the paripatae in its ascent meets the licanus in its descent supplies a boundary to the loci, the lower locus being that of the paripatae, the higher that of the licanus. Having thus determined the total loci of the licanus and paripatae, we shall now proceed to ascertain their loci as qualified by genus and shade. The proper method of investigating whether the fourth can be expressed in terms of any lower intervals, or whether it is incommensurable with them at all, is given in my chapter on intervals ascertained by the principle of concord. Here we shall assume that its apparent value is correct, and that it consists of 2½ tones. Again, we shall apply the term pycnum to the combination of 2 intervals, the sum of which is less than the complement that makes up the fourth. Let us now, starting from the lower of the 2 fixed notes, take the least pycnum. It will consist of the 2 least enharmonic diaces, while a second pycnum, taken from the same note, will consist of 2 of the least chromatic diaces. This gives the 2 lowest licani of 2 genera, the enharmonic and the chromatic. The enharmonic licani being in general, as we saw, the lowest, the chromatic coming next, and the diatonic being the highest. Again, let a third pycnum be taken, still from the same note, then a fourth, which is equal to a tone, then fifthly, from the same note, let there be taken a scale consisting of a tone and a quarter, then a sixth scale consisting of a tone and a half. We have already mentioned the Lacani bounding the first and the second pycna. That bounding the third is chromatic, and the special chroma to which it belongs is called the hemiolic. The Lacanus bounding the fourth pycnum is also chromatic, and the special class to which it belongs is called the tonic chromatic. The fifth scale is too great for a pycnum, for here the sum of the intervals between the hypatae and peripatae, and between the peripatae and the Lacanus is equal to the interval between the Lacanus and the messe. The Lacanus bounding this scale is the lowest diatonic. The sixth scale, we assumed, is bounded by the highest diatonic Lacanus. Thus, the lowest chromatic Lacanus is 1/6 of a tone higher than the lowest enharmonic, since the chromatic diaces is greater than the enharmonic by 1/12 of a tone, the third of a quantity being 1/12 greater than the fourth. And similarly, the two chromatic diaces exceed the two enharmonic by double that quantity, namely 1/6. An interval smaller than the smallest admitted in melody. Such intervals are not melodic elements, or, in other words, cannot take an independent place in a scale. Again, the lowest diatonic Lacanus is 7/12 of a tone higher than the lowest chromatic. For from the former to the Lacanus of the hemiolic chroma is half a tone, from this Lacanus to the enharmonic is a diaces, from the enharmonic Lacanus to the lowest chromatic is 1/6 of a tone, while from the lowest chromatic to that of the hemiolic chroma is 1/12 of a tone. But as a quarter consists of 3/12, it is clear that there is the interval just mentioned between the lowest diatonic and the lowest chromatic Lacanus. The highest diatonic Lacanus is higher than the lowest diatonic by a diaces. These considerations show the locus of each of the Lacani. Every Lacanus below the chromatic is enharmonic. Every Lacanus below the diatonic is chromatic down to the lowest chromatic, and every Lacanus lower than the highest diatonic is diatonic down to the lowest diatonic. For we must regard the Lacani as infinite in number. Let the voice become stationary at any point in the locus of the Lacanus here demonstrated, and the result is a Lacanus. In the locus of the Lacanus, there is no empty space, no space incapable of admitting a Lacanus. The point we are discussing is of no little importance. Other musicians only dispute as to the position of the Lacanus, whether, for instance, the Lacanus in the enharmonic species is 2 tones removed from the messe or holds a higher position, thus assuming but one enharmonic Lacanus. We, on the other hand, not only assert that there is a plurality of the Lacani in each class, but even declare that their number is infinite. Passing from the Lacani, we find but 2 loci for the peripetae, one common to the diatonic and chromatic genus, and one peculiar to the enharmonic. For 2 of the genera have the peripetae in common. Every peripetae lower than the lowest chromatic is enharmonic. Every other down to this point of limitation is chromatic and diatonic. As regards the intervals, while that between the hypatae and peripatae is either equal to or less than that between the peripatae and the Lacanus, the latter may be less than, equal to, or greater than that between the Lacanus and the messe, the reason being that the 2 genera have their peripatae in common. We can't have a melodious tetrachord with the lowest chromatic peripatae and the highest diatonic Lacanus. Enough has now been said to show how great is the locus of the peripatae, both in respect of its subdivisions and when regarded as a whole. Of continuity and consecution, it would be no easy task to give accurate definitions at the outset, but a few rough indications must be offered. Continuity in melody seems in its nature to correspond to that continuity in speech which is observable in the collocation of the letters. In speaking, the voice by a natural law places one letter first in each syllable, another second, another third, another fourth, and so on. This is done in no random order, rather, the growth of the whole from the parts follows a natural law. Similarly, in singing, the voice seems to arrange its intervals and notes on a principle of continuity, observing a natural law of collocation, and not placing any interval at random after another, whether equal or unequal. In inquiring into continuity, we must avoid the examples set by the harmonists in their condensed diagrams, where they mark as consecutive notes those that are separated from one another by the smallest interval. For so far is the voice from being able to produce 28 consecutive diaces that it can, by no effort, produce 3 diaces in succession. If ascending after 2 diaces, it can produce nothing less than the complement of the fourth, and that is either 8 times the smallest diaces, or falls short of it only by a minute and unmelodic interval. If, descending, it cannot, after the 2 diaces, introduce any interval less than a tone, it is not then in the mere equality or inequality of successive intervals that we must seek the clue to the principle of continuity. We must direct our eyes to the natural laws of melody, and endeavor to discover what intervals the voice is by nature capable of placing in succession in a melodic series. For if after the peripatei and the lacanus the voice can produce no note nearer than the messe, then the messe is the next note to the lacanus, whether the interval between them be twice or several times that between the lacanus and the peripatei. The proper method of investigating continuity is now clear, but how it arises and what intervals do and do not form a succession are questions which will be treated in the Elements. We shall here assume that, having posited a pycnum or a scale that is not a pycnum, the smallest interval that can succeed in the ascending scale is the complement of the interval of the fourth, and that the smallest similarly in the descending scale is a tone. We shall assume that if a series of notes be arranged in proper melodic continuity in any genus, any note in that series will either form with the fourth from it in order the concord of the fourth, or with the fifth from it in order the concord of the fifth, while possibly forming both. A note that answers to none of these tests cannot belong to the same melodic series as those with which it makes no concord. Further, we shall assume that whereas there are 4 intervals contained in the interval of the fifth, 2 of which are equal, viz., those constituting the pycnum, and 2 unequal, 1 the complement of the first, concord, the other the excess of the interval of the fifth over that of the fourth. The unequal intervals which succeed the equal intervals do so in different order according as we ascend or descend the scale. We shall assume, too, that the notes which form respectively the same concord with consecutive notes are themselves consecutive, that in each genus a simple melodic interval is one which the voice cannot divide in a melodic progression, that not all magnitudes into which a concord can be divided are simple, that a sequence is a progression by consecutive notes, each of which, between the first and last, is preceded and succeeded by a simple interval, and that a direct sequence is one that maintains the same direction throughout. End of Book 1. Book 2. It will be well perhaps to review in anticipation the course of our study. Thus a foreknowledge of the road that we must travel will enable us to recognize each stage as we reach it, and so lighten the toil of the journey. Nor shall we be harboring unknown to ourselves a false conception of our subject. Such was the condition, as Aristotle used often to relate, of most of the audience that attended Plato's lectures on the good. They came, he used to say, every one of them in the conviction that they would get from the lectures some one or other of the things that the world calls good, riches or health or strength, in fine some extraordinary gift of fortune. But when they found that Plato's reasonings were of sciences and numbers and geometry and astronomy, and of good and unity as predicates of the finite, methinks their disenchantment was complete. The result was that some of them sneered at the thing, while others vilified it. Now, to what was all this trouble due? To the fact that they had not waited to inform themselves of the nature of the subject, but after the manner of the sect of word-catchers, had flocked round open-mouthed, attracted by the mere title, good in itself. But if a general exposition of the subject had been given in advance, the intending pupil would either have abandoned his intention, or, if he was pleased with the exposition, would have remained in the said conviction to the end. It was for these very reasons, as he told us, that Aristotle himself used to give his intending pupils a preparatory statement of the subject and method of his course of study. and we agree with him in thinking, as we said at the beginning, that such prior information is desirable, for mistakes are often made in both directions. Some consider harmonic a sublime science, and expect a course of it to make them musicians. Nay, some even conceive it will exalt their moral nature. This mistake is due to their having run away with such phrases in our preamble as, "We aim at the construction of every style of melody," and with our general statement, "One class of musical art is hurtful to the moral character, another improves it," while they miss completely our qualification of this statement, insofar as musical art can improve the moral character. Then, on the other hand, there are persons who regard harmonic as quite a thing of no importance, and actually prefer to remain totally unacquainted even with its nature and aim. Neither of these views is correct. On the one hand, the science is no proper object of contempt to the man of intelligence. This we shall see as the discussion progresses. Nor, on the other hand, has it the quality of all sufficiency, as some imagine. To be a musician, as we are always insisting, implies much more than a knowledge of harmonic, which is the only one part of the musician's equipment, on the same level as the sciences of rhythm, of meter, of instruments. We shall now proceed to the consideration of harmonic and its parts. It is to be observed that in general the subject of our study is the question, in melody of every kind, what are the natural laws according to which the voice in ascending or descending places the intervals? For we hold that the voice follows a natural law in its motion, and does not place the intervals at random. And of our answers we endeavor to supply proofs that will be in agreement with the phenomena. In this, unlike our predecessors. For some of these introduce extraneous reasoning, and, rejecting the senses as inaccurate, fabricated rational principles asserting that height and depth of pitch consist in certain numerical ratios and relative rates of vibration. A theory utterly extraneous to the subject and quite at variance with the phenomena, while others, dispensing with reason and demonstration, confine themselves to isolated dogmatic statements, not being successful either in their enumeration of the mere phenomena. It is our endeavor that the principles which we assume shall without exception be evident to those who understand music, and that we shall advance to our conclusions by strict demonstration. Our subject matter, then, being all melody, whether vocal or instrumental, our method rests in the last resort on an appeal to the two faculties of hearing and intellect. By the former we judge the magnitudes of the intervals, by the latter we contemplate the functions of the notes. We must therefore accustom ourselves to an accurate discrimination of particulars. It is usual in geometric constructions to use such a phrase as, "Let this be a straight line." But one must not be content with such a language of assumption in the case of intervals. The geometrician makes no use of his faculty of sense perception. He does not in any degree train his sight to discriminate the straight line, the circle, or any other figure, such training belonging rather to the practice of the carpenter, the turner, or some other such handicraftsman. But for the student of musical science, accuracy of sense perception is a fundamental requirement. For if his sense perception is deficient, it is impossible for him to deal successfully with those questions that lie outside the sphere of sense perception altogether. This will become clear in the course of our investigation, and we must bear in mind that musical cognition implies the simultaneous cognition of a permanent and of a changeable element, and that this applies without limitation or qualification to every branch of music. To begin with, our perception of the differences of the genera is dependent on the permanence of the containing and the variation of the intermediate notes. Again, while the magnitude remains constant, we distinguish the interval between hypetae and messe from that between paramesse and nete. Here, then, the magnitude is permanent, while the functions of the notes change. Similarly, when there are several figures of the same magnitude, as of the fourth or fifth, or any other, similarly when the same interval leads or does not lead to modulation according to its position. Again, in matters of rhythm, we find many similar examples. Without any change in the characteristic proportion constituting any one genus of rhythm, the lengths of the feet vary in obedience to the general rate of movement. And while the magnitudes are constant, the quality of the feet undergoes a change, and the same magnitude serves a foot and as a combination of feet. Plainly, too, unless there was a permanent quantum to deal with, there could be no distinctions as to the methods of dividing it and arranging its parts. And in general, while rhythmical composition employs a rich variety of movements, the movements of the feet by which we note the rhythms are always simple and the same. Such then being the nature of music, we must in matters of harmony also accustom both ear and intellect to a correct judgment of the permanent and changeable element alike. These remarks have exhibited the general character of the science called harmonic, and of this science there are, as a fact, 7 parts. Of these one and the first is to define the genera, and to show what are the permanent and what are the changeable elements presupposed by this distinction. None of our predecessors have drawn this distinction at all, nor is this to be wondered at, for they confine their attention to the enharmonic genus, to the neglect of the other 2. Students of instruments, it is true, could not fail to distinguish each genus by ear, but none of them reflected even on the question. At what point does the enharmonic begin to pass into the chromatic? For their ability to discriminate each genus extended not to all the shades, inasmuch as they were not acquainted with all styles of musical composition or trained to exercise a nice discrimination in such distinctions. Nor did they even observe that there were certain loci of the notes that altered their position with the change of genus. These reasons sufficiently explain why the genera have not as yet been definitely distinguished. But it is evident that we must supply this deficiency if we are to follow the differences that present themselves in works of musical composition. Such is the first branch of harmonic. In the second we shall deal with intervals, omitting to the best of our ability none of the distinctions to be found in them. The majority of these, one might say, have as yet escaped observation. But we must bear in mind that wherever we come upon a distinction which has been overlooked and not scientifically considered, we shall there fail to recognize the distinctions in works of melodic composition. Again, since intervals are not in themselves sufficient to distinguish notes, for every magnitude without qualification that an interval can possess is common to several musical functions, the third part of our science will deal with notes, their number, and the means of recognizing them, and will consider the question whether they are certain points of pitch, as is vulgarly supposed, or whether they are musical functions, and also what is the meaning of a musical function. Not one of these questions is clearly conceived by students of the subject. The fourth part will consider scales, firstly, as to their number and nature, secondly, as to the manner of their construction from the intervals and notes. Our predecessors have not regarded this part of the subject in either of these respects. On the one hand, no attention has been devoted to the questions whether intervals are collocated in any order to produce scales, or whether some collocations may not transgress a natural law. On the other hand, the distinctions in scales have not been completely enumerated by any of them. As to the first point, our forerunners simply ignored the distinction between melodious and unmelodious. As to the second, they either made no attempt at all at enumeration of scale distinctions, confining their attention to the 7 octave scales which they call harmonies. Or, if they made the attempt, they fell very short of completeness, like the school of Pythagoras of Zacynthus and Agenor of Mytilene. The order that distinguishes the melodious from the unmelodious resembles that which we find in the collocation of letters in language, for it is not every collocation, but only certain collocations of any given letters that will produce a syllable. The fifth part of our science deals with keys, in which the scales are placed for the purposes of melody. No explanation has yet been offered of the manner in which those keys are to be found, or of the principle by which one must be guided in enunciating their number. The account of the keys given by the harmonists closely resemble the observance of the days according to which, for example, the 10th day of the month at Corinth is the 5th at Athens, and the 8th somewhere else. Just in the same way, some of the harmonists hold that the hypodorian is the lowest of the keys, that half a tone above lies the mixolydian, half a tone higher again the dorian, a tone above the dorian the phrygian, likewise a tone above the phrygian the lydian. The number is sometimes increased by the addition of the hypophrygian clarinet at the bottom of the list. Others again, having regard to the boring of finger holes of the flutes, assume intervals of 3/4 tones between the 3 lowest keys, the hypophrygian and the hypodorian and the dorian, a tone between the dorian and phrygian, 3/4 tones again between the phrygian and lydian, and the same distance between the lydian and mixolydian. But they have not informed us on what principle they have persuaded themselves to this location of the keys. and that the close packing of small intervals is unmelodious and of no practical value whatsoever will be clear in the course of our discussion. Again, since some melodies are simple and others contain a modulation, we must treat of modulation, considering first the nature of modulation in the abstract and how it arises, or in other words, to what modification in the melodic order it owes its existence. Secondly, how many modulations there are in all, and at what intervals they occur. On these questions we find no statements by our predecessors with or without proof. The last section of our science is concerned with the actual construction of melody, for since, in the same notes, indifferent in themselves, we have the choice of numerous melodic forms of every character, it is evident that here we have the practical question of the employment of the notes. And this is what we mean by the construction of melody. The science of harmony, having traversed the said sections, will find its consummation here. It is plain, then, that the apprehension of a melody consists in noting with both ear and intellect every distinction as it arises in the successive sounds. Successive, for melody, like all branches of music, consists in a successive production. For the apprehension of music depends on these two faculties, sense perception and memory. For we must perceive the sound that is present and remember that which is past. In no other way can we follow the phenomenon of music. Now, some find the goal of the science called harmonic in the notation of melodies, declaring this to be the ultimate limit of the apprehension of any given melody. Others again find it in the knowledge of clarinets, and in the ability to tell the manner of production of and the agencies employed in any piece rendered on the clarinet. Such views are conclusive evidence of an utter misconception. So far is notation from being the perfection of harmonic science that it is not even a part of it, any more than the marking of any particular meter is a part of metrical science. As in the latter case, one might very well mark the scheme of the iambic meter without understanding its essence. So it is with melody also. If a man notes down the Phrygian scale, it does not follow that he must know the essence of the Phrygian scale. Plainly, then, notation is not the ultimate limit of our science. That the premises of our argument are true, and that the faculty of musical notation argues nothing beyond a discernment of the size of the intervals, will be clear on consideration. In the use of signs for the intervals, no peculiar mark is employed to denote all their individual distinctions, such as the several methods of dividing the fourth which depend on the differences of genera, or the several figures of the same interval which result from a variation in the disposition of the simple intervals. It is the same with the musical functions proper to the natures of the different tetrachords. The same notation is employed for the tetrachords hyperboalion, neton, meson, and hypaton. Thus, the signs fail to distinguish the functional differences and, consequently, indicate the magnitudes of the intervals and nothing more. But that the mere sense discrimination of magnitudes is no part of the general comprehension of music was stated in the introduction, and the following considerations will make it patent. Mere knowledge of magnitudes does not enlighten one as to the functions of the tetrachords, or of the notes, or the differences of the genera, or briefly, the difference of simple and compound intervals, or the distinction between modulating and non-modulating scales, or the modes of melodic construction, or indeed, anything else of the kind. Now, if the harmonists, as they are called, have in their ignorance seriously entertained this view, while there is nothing preposterous in their motives, their ignorance must be profound and invincible. But if, being aware that notation is not the final goal of harmonic, they have propounded this view merely through the desire to please amateurs, and to represent, as the perfection of the science, a certain visible activity, their motives deserve condemnation as very preposterous indeed. In the first place, they would constitute the amateur judge of the sciences, and it is preposterous that the same person should be learner and judge of the same thing. In the second place, they reverse the proper order in their fancy of representing a visible activity as the consummation of intellectual apprehension. For, as a fact, the ultimate factor in every visible activity is the intellectual process. For this latter is the presiding and determining principle, and as for the hands, voice, mouth, or breath, it is an error to suppose that they are very much more than inanimate instruments. And if this intellectual activity is something hidden deep down in the soul, and is not palpable or apparent to the ordinary man, as the operations of the hand and the like are apparent, we must not on that account alter our views. We shall be sure to miss the truth unless we place the supreme and ultimate not in the thing determined, but in the activity that determines. No less preposterous is the above-mentioned theory concerning clarinets. Nay, rather, there is no error so fatal and so preposterous as to base the natural laws of harmony on any instrument. The essence and order of harmony depend not upon any of the properties of instruments. It is not because the clarinet has finger holes and bores and the like, nor is it because it submits to certain operations of the hands and of the other parts naturally adapted to raise and lower the pitch, that the fourth and the fifth and the octave are concords, or that each of the other intervals possesses its proper magnitude. For even with all these conditions present, players on the clarinet fail for the most part to attain the exact order of the melody, and whatever small success attends them is due to the employment of agencies external to the instrument, as in the well-known expedients of drawing the two clarinets apart and bringing them alongside, and of raising and lowering the pitch by changing the pressure of the breath. Plainly, then, one is as such justified in attributing their failures as their success to the essential nature of the clarinet. But this would not have been so if there was anything gained by basing harmony on the nature of an instrument. In that case, as an immediate consequence of tracing melody up to its original in the nature of the clarinet, we should have found it there fixed, unerring, and correct. But, as a fact, neither clarinets nor any other instrument will supply a foundation for the principles of harmony. There is a certain marvelous order which belongs to the nature of harmony in general. In this order, every instrument, to the best of its ability, participates under the direction of that faculty of sense perception on which they, as well as everything else in music, finally depend. So suppose, because one sees day by day the finger holes the same and the strings at the same tension, that one will find in these harmony with its permanence and eternally immutable order, this is sheer folly. As there is no harmony in the strings save that which the cunning of the hand confers upon them, so is there none in the finger holes save what has been introduced by the same agency. That no instrument is self-tuned, and that the harmonizing of it is the prerogative of the sense perception is obvious, and requires no proof. It is strange that the supporters of this absurd theory can cling to it in face of the fact that clarinets are perpetually in a state of change. And of course, what is played on the instrument varies with the variation in the agencies employed in its production. It is surely clear, then, that on no consideration can melody be based on clarinets. For, firstly, an instrument will not supply a foundation for the order of harmony, and secondly, even if it were supposed that harmony should be based on some one instrument, the choice should not have fallen on the clarinet, an instrument especially liable to aberrations resulting from the manufacture and manipulation of it, and from its own peculiar nature. This will suffice as an introductory account of harmonic science. But as we prepare ourselves to enter upon the study of the elements, we must at the outset attend the following considerations. Our exposition cannot be a successful one unless three conditions be fulfilled. Firstly, the phenomena themselves must be correctly observed. Secondly, what is prior and what is derivative in them must be properly discriminated. Thirdly, our conclusions and inferences must follow legitimately from the premises. And, as in every science that consists of several propositions, the proper course is to find certain principles from which to deduce the dependent truths. We must be guided in our selection of principles by two considerations. Firstly, every proposition that is to serve as a principle must be true and evident. Secondly, it must be such as to be accepted by the sense perception as one of the primary truths of harmonic science. For what requires demonstration cannot stand as a fundamental principle, and in general we must be watchful in determining our highest principles, lest, on the one hand, we let ourselves be dragged outside the proper track of our science by beginning with sound in general regarded as air vibration, or on the other hand, turn short of the flag and abandon much of what truly belongs to harmonic. There are three genera of melodies: diatonic, chromatic, and enharmonic. The differences between them will be stated hereafter. This may be laid down that every melody must be diatonic, or chromatic, or enharmonic, or blended of these kinds, or composed of what they have in common. The second classification of intervals is into concords and discords. The two most familiar distinctions in intervals are difference of magnitude and difference between concords and discords. And the latter of these is embraced by the former, since every concord differs from every discord in magnitude. Now, there being many distinctions among concords, let us first treat of the most familiar of them, namely, difference of magnitude. We assume then 8 magnitudes of concords, the smallest, the fourth, determined as smallest by the abstract nature of melody, for while we can produce several smaller intervals, they are all discords. Next smallest, the fifth, all intervals between the fourth and fifth being discords. The third smallest, the sum of the first two, that is the octave, all intervals between the fifth and the octave being discords. So far, we have been stating what we have learned from our predecessors. Henceforth, we must arrive at our conclusions unaided. In the first place, then, we shall assert that if any concord be added to the octave, the sum is a concord. This property is peculiar to the octave, for if to an octave be added any concord, whether less than, equal to, or greater than itself, the sum is a concord. But this is not the case with the two smallest concords, for the doubling of a fourth or fifth does not produce a concord, nor does the addition to either one of them of the concord compounded of the octave and that one, but the sum of such concords will always be a discord. A tone is the excess of the fifth over the fourth. The fourth consists of 2 tones and a half. The following fractions of a tone occur in melody. The half, called a semitone, the third, called the smallest chromatic diaces, the quarter, called the smallest enharmonic diaces. No smaller interval than that exists in the melody. Here we have 2 cautions for our hearers. Firstly, many have misunderstood us to say that melody admits the division of the tone into 3 or 4 equal parts. This misunderstanding is due to their not observing that to employ the third part of a tone is a very different thing from dividing a tone into 3 parts and singing all 3. Secondly, from an abstract point of view, no doubt, we regard no interval as the smallest possible. The differences of the genera are found in such a tetrachord, as that from messe to hypate, where the extremes are fixed, while one or both of the means vary. As the variable note must move in a certain locus, we must ascertain the limits of the locus of each of these intermediate notes. The highest, licanus, is that which is a tone removed from the messe. It constitutes the genus diatonic. The lowest is that which is 2 tones below the messe. This is enharmonic. The locus of the licanus is thus seen to be a tone. The interval between the periphatai and the hypatai cannot plainly be less than an enharmonic diaces, for this latter is the minimum melodic distance. It is to be observed also that it can only be extended to twice that distance, for when the licanus in its descent and the peripatai in its ascent reach the same pitch, the locus of each note finds its limit. Thus it is that the locus of the peripatai is not greater than the smallest diaces. This proposition has afforded some students great perplexity. If, they ask in surprise, the interval between the messe and the licanus, assuming it to be any one of the above-mentioned intervals, be increased or diminished, how can the note bounding the new interval be a licanus? There is admittedly but one interval between the messe and the paramesse, and again between the messe and the hypatai, and in fact between any pair of the permanent notes. Why, then, should we admit a plurality of intervals between the messe and the licanus? Surely it would be better to change the names of the notes, and restricting the term licanus to any one of them, the 2-tone or any other, to employ other designations from the rest. For notes that bound unequal magnitude must be different notes. And one might add that the converse is equally valid, namely, that the boundaries of equal magnitudes must have the same designations. To these objections the following reply was given. In the first place, to postulate that a difference in notes necessarily implies a difference in the magnitudes bounded by them is a startling innovation. We see that the nete and the messe differ in function from the perinete and licanus, and the perinete and licanus again from the trite and peripatai. and these latter again from the paramesse and hypatae, and for this reason each pair has names of its own, though the contained interval is in every case a fifth. Thus it is seen that a difference in the contained intervals is not necessarily implied by a difference of notes. That the converse implication is equally inadmissible will appear from the following remarks. In the first place, if we seek particular designations to suit every increase and decrease in the intervals of the pictum, we shall evidently need an infinite library, since the locus of the lecanus is infinitely divisible. For, as a matter of fact, to which of the disputants as to the shades of the genera should we give our adherence? Every one is not guided by the same divisions in harmonizing the chromatic or enharmonic scale. Why then should the term lecanus be applied to the two-tone lecanus rather than to one slightly higher? Whichever division be employed, the ear equally recognizes an enharmonic genus. Yet, it is plain that the magnitudes of the intervals are different in the two divisions. In the second place, if we have eyes exclusively for equality and inequality, we shall miss the distinction between the like and unlike. Thus we shall have to restrict the term pictum to one particular magnitude, as likewise evidently the terms enharmonic and chromatic. For they too are determined not to a point, but to a locus. But it is evident that such a restriction is not in accordance with the mode in which sense forms its representations. It is by considering the common qualities found in some one class, not the magnitude of some one interval, that sense employs such terms as pictum, chromatic, enharmonic. That is to say, it constitutes a class pictum to embrace every case in which the two intervals occupy a smaller space than the one. For in all picta, though they are unequal in size, there is evident to the ear the sound of a certain compression. Likewise, it constitutes a class chromatic to embrace all cases in which the chromatic character is apparent, for the ear detects a motion peculiar to each of the genera, though each genus employs not one but many divisions of the tetrachord. Thus it is clear that while the magnitudes change, the genus may remain unaltered, for up to a certain point, changes in the magnitudes do not involve a change of genus. And if the genus remains the same, it is reasonable to suppose that the functions of the notes may be permanent also. For the species of the tetrachord is the same, and for this reason, we must hold that the boundaries of the intervals are the same notes. In general, as long as the names of the extreme notes remain the same, the higher being called messe and the lower hypatae, so long will the names of the intermediate notes also remain the same, the higher being called lecanus and the lower peripatae. For the notes between the messe and the hypatae are always stamped by the ear as lecanus and peripatae. To demand that all notes bounding equal intervals should have the same names, or that all notes bounding unequal intervals should have different names, is to join battle with the evidence of the senses. For in melody, we make the interval between the hypatae and the parahypatae sometimes equal and sometimes unequal to that between the parahypatae and the lecanus. Now, in the case of two equal consecutive intervals, it is impossible that the notes bounding each of them should be designated by the same terms, unless the middle note is to have two names. The absurdity is also evident when the above-mentioned intervals are unequal, for it is impossible that one of any pair of such names should change while the other remains the same, since the names have meaning only in their relation to one another. So much for this objection. The term pictum we shall employ in all cases when, in a tetrachord, whose extremes from a fourth, the sum of two of the intervals occupies a lesser space than the third, there are certain divisions of the tetrachord which stand out from the rest as familiar, because the magnitudes of the intervals in them are familiar. Of these divisions, one is enharmonic, in which the pictum is a semitone, and its complement two tones. Three are chromatic, namely the soft, the hemiolic, and the tonic chromatic. The division of the soft chromatic is that which the pictum consists of two of the smallest chromatic diases, while its complement is expressed in terms of two quanta, namely a semitone taken thrice, and a chromatic diasis taken once, so that the sum of its amount to 3 semitones and the third of a tone. This is the smallest of the chromatic pycna, and its lacanus is the lowest in its genus. The division of the hemiolic chromatic is that in which the pycnum is 1.5 times the enharmonic pycnum, and each diasis 1.5 times an enharmonic diasis. It is manifest that the hemiolic pycnum is greater than the soft, since the former is less than a tone by an enharmonic diasis, the latter by a chromatic diasis. The division of the tonic chromatic is that in which the pycnum consists of 2 semitones, and its complement of a tone and a half. Up to this point, both the inner notes vary, but now the peripatae, having traversed the whole of its locus, remains at rest, while the lacanus moves an enharmonic diasis. Thus the interval between the lacanus and hypatae become equal to that between the lacanus and the messe, so that the pycnum does not occur in this division as in the preceding. The disappearance of the pycnum in the division of the tetrachord is coincident with the first appearance of the diatonic genus. There are 2 divisions of the diatonic genus, the soft and the sharp diatonic. The division of the soft diatonic is that in which the interval between the hypatae and the peripatae is a semitone, that between the peripatae and the lacanus 3 enharmonic diases, that between the lacanus and the messe 5 diases. The division of the sharp diatonic is that in which the interval between the hypatae and peripatae is a semitone, while each of the remaining intervals is a tone. Thus, while we have 6 licani, as there are 6 divisions of the tetrachord, 1 enharmonic, 3 chromatic, and 2 diatonic, we have but 4 peripatae, that is, 2 less than the divisions of the tetrachord. For the semitone peripatae is employed for both diatonic divisions and for the tonic chromatic. Thus, of the 4 peripatae, 1 is peculiar to the enharmonic genus, while the diatonic and chromatic between them employ 3. Of the intervals in the tetrachord, that between the hypatae and peripatae may be equal to that between the peripatae and lacanus, or less than it, but never greater. That it may be equal is evident from the enharmonic and chromatic division of the tetrachord. That it may be less is evident from the diatonic scales, and also may be ascertained in the chromatic by taking a peripatae of the soft and a lacanus of the tonic chromatic. For such divisions of the pycnum sound melodious. But to adopt the opposite order produces an unmelodious result. For instance, to take the semitone peripatae and the lacanus of the hemiolic chromatic, or of the peripatae of the hemiolic and the lacanus of the soft chromatic. Such divisions produce an inharmonious effect. On the other hand, the interval between the peripatae and lacanus may be equal to, greater than, or less than that between the lacanus and messe. It is equal in the sharp diatonic, less in all the other shades, and greater when we employ as lacanus the highest of the diatonic licani, and as peripatae any one lower than that of the semitone. We shall next proceed to explain, beginning with a general indication, the method by which we should expect to determine the nature of continuity. To put it generally, in investigating continuity, the laws of melody must be our guide, nor must we imitate those who shape their account of continuity with a view to the massing of small intervals. Such theorists plainly disregard the natural sequence of melody, as appears from the number of diases that they place in succession, for the voice's power of connecting diases stops short of 3. Thus it appears that continuity must not be sought in the smallest intervals, nor in equal nor in unequal intervals. We must rather follow the guidance of natural laws. Now, though it were no easy matter at present to offer an accurate exposition of the continuity before we have explained the collocation of intervals, yet the veriest novice can see from the following reasoning that there is such a thing as continuity. It would be admitted that there is no interval which can be divided ad infinitum in melody, and that the natural laws of melody assign a maximum number of fractions to every interval. Assuming that this will be, or rather must be, admitted, we necessarily infer that the notes containing fractions of the said number are consecutive. To this class belong the notes which, as a matter of fact, have been in use from the earliest times, as for instance the nete, the paranete, and those that follow them. Our next duty will be to determine the first and most indispensable condition of the melodious collocation of intervals, whatever be the genus from whatever note one starts. If the melody moves in continuous progression either upwards or downwards, the fourth note in order from any note must form with it the concord of the fourth, or the fifth note in order from it the concord of the fifth. Any note that answers neither of these tests must be regarded as out of tune in relation to these notes with which it fails to form the above-mentioned concords. It must be observed, however, that the above rule is not all sufficient for the melodious construction of scales from intervals. It is quite possible that the notes of a scale might form the above-mentioned concords with one another, and yet that the scale might be unmelodiously constructed. But if this condition be not fulfilled, all else is useless. Let us assume this, then, as a fundamental principle, the violation of which is the destruction of harmony. A law in some respects similar holds with regard to the relative position of tetrachords. If any tetrachords are to belong to the same scale, one or other of the following conditions must be fulfilled. Either they must be in concord with each other, the notes of one forming some concord or other with the corresponding notes of the other, or they must both be in concord with a third tetrachord, with which they are alike continuous but in opposite directions. This in itself is not sufficient to constitute tetrachords of the same scale. Certain other conditions must be satisfied, of which we shall speak hereafter. But the absence of the condition renders the rest useless. When we consider the magnitudes of intervals, we find that while the concords either have no locus of variation, and are definitely determined to one magnitude, or have an appreciable locus, this definiteness is to be found in a much lesser degree in discords. For this reason, the ear is much more assured of the magnitudes of the concords than of the discords. It follows that the most accurate method of ascertaining a discord is by the principle of concordance. If, then, a certain note may be given, and it be required to find a certain discord below it, such as the ditone, or any other that can be ascertained by the method of concordance, one should take the fourth above the given note, then descend a fifth, then ascend a fourth again, and finally descend another fifth. Thus, the interval of two tones below the given note will have been ascertained. If it be required to ascertain the discord in the other direction, the concords must be taken in the other direction. Also, if a discord be subtracted from a concord by the method of concordance, the remaining discord is thereby ascertained on the same principle. For subtract the ditone from the fourth on the principle of concordance, and it is evident that the notes bounding the excess of the latter over the former will have been found on the same principle. For the bounding notes of the fourth are concords to begin with, and from the higher of these a concord is taken, namely the fourth above. From the note thus found another, namely the fifth below, from this again a fourth above, and finally from this a fifth below. And the last concord alights on the higher of the notes bounding the excess of the fourth over the ditone. Thus it appears that if a discord be subtracted from a concord by the method of concordance, the complement also will have been thereby ascertained on the same principle. The surest method of verifying our original assumption that the fourth consists of 2½ tones is the following. Let us take an interval, and let us find the discord of 2 tones above its lower note, and the same discord below its higher note. Evidently, the complements will be equal, since they are remainders obtained by subtracting equals from equals. Next, let us take the fourth above the lower note of the higher ditone, and the fourth below the higher note of the lower ditone. It will be seen that adjacent to each of the extreme notes of the scale thus obtained, there will be 2 complements in juxtaposition, which must be equal for the reasons already given. This construction completed, we must refer the extreme notes thus determined to the judgment of the ear. If they prove discordant, plainly the fourth will not be composed of 2½ tones, and just as plainly it will be so composed if they form a fifth, for the lowest of the assumed notes is, by construction, a fourth of the higher boundary of the lower ditone, and it has now turned out that the highest of the assumed notes forms with the lowest of them, the concord of the fifth. Now, as the excess of the latter interval over the former is a tone, and as it is here divided into two equal parts, and as each of these equal parts, which is thus proved to be a semitone, is at the same time the excess of the fourth over a ditone, it follows that the fourth is composed of 5 semitones. It will be readily seen that the extremes of our scale cannot form any concord except a fifth. They cannot form a fourth, for there is here, besides the original fourth, an additional complement at each extremity. They cannot form an octave, for the sum of the complements is less than 2 tones, since the excess of the fourth over the ditone is less than a tone. For it is universally admitted that the fourth is greater than 2 tones and less than 3. Consequently, the whole of what is here added to the fourth is less than a fifth. Plainly, then, their sum cannot be an octave. But if the concord formed by the extreme notes of our construction is greater than a fourth and less than an octave, it must be a fifth, for this is the only concordant magnitude between the fourth and octave. End of Book 2. Book 3. Successive tetrachords are either conjunct or disjunct. We shall employ the term conjunction when two successive tetrachords, similar in figure, have a common note. The term disjunction when two successive tetrachords, similar in figure, are separated by the interval of a tone. That successive tetrachords must be related in either of these ways is evident from our axioms. For a series in which each note forms a fourth, with the fourth note in order from it, will constitute conjunct tetrachords, while disjunct tetrachords result when each note forms a fifth with the fifth from it. Now, as all successions of notes must fulfill one or other of these conditions, so all successive similar tetrachords must be either conjunct or disjunct. Difficulties have been raised by some of my hearers on the question of succession. It has been asked, firstly, what is succession in general? Secondly, does it appear in one form only, or in several? Thirdly, are conjunct and disjunct tetrachords equally successive? To these questions, the following answers have been given. In general, scales are continuous, whose boundaries either are successive or coincide. There are 2 forms of succession in scales. In the one, the upper boundary of the lower scale coincides with the lower boundary of the upper scale. In the other, the lower boundary of the higher scale is in the line of succession with the higher boundary of the lower scale. In the first of these forms, the scales of the successive tetrachords have a certain space in common, and are necessarily similar in figure. In the other form, they are separated from one another, and the species of the tetrachords may be similar only on condition, however, that the separating interval is 1 tone. Thus, we are led to conclude that 2 similar tetrachords are successive, if they are either separated by a tone, or if their boundaries coincide. Consequently, similar successive tetrachords are either conjunct or disjunct. We also assert that 2 successive tetrachords either must be separated by no tetrachord whatsoever, or must not be separated by a tetrachord dissimilar to themselves. Tetrachords similar in species cannot be separated by a dissimilar tetrachord, and dissimilar but successive tetrachords cannot be separated by any tetrachord whatsoever. Hence, we see that tetrachords similar in species can be arranged in succession in the 2 forms mentioned above. The interval contained by successive notes is simple. For if containing notes are successive, no note is wanting. If none is wanting, none will intrude. If none intrudes, none will divide the interval. But that which excludes division excludes composition, for every composite is composed of certain parts into which it is divisible. The above proposition is often the object of perplexity on account of the ambiguous character of the intervallic magnitudes. How, it is asked in surprise, can the ditone possibly be simple, seeing that it can be divided into tones? Or how again is it possible for the tone to be simple, seeing that it can be divided into 2 semitones? And the same point is raised about the semitone. This perplexity arises from the failure to observe that some intervallic magnitudes are common to simple and compound intervals. For this reason, the simplicity of an interval is determined not by its magnitude, but the relations of the notes that bound it. The ditone is simple when bounded by the messe and licanus. When bounded by the messe and peripatae, it is compound. This is why we assert that simplicity does not depend on the sizes of the intervals, but on the containing notes. In variations of genus, it is only the parts of the fourth that undergo change. All harmonious scales consisting of more than one tetrachord were divided into conjunct and disjunct, but conjunct scales are composed of the simple parts of the fourth alone, so that here at least it will be the parts of the fourth alone that will undergo change. Again, disjunct scales comprise, besides these parts of the fourth, a tone peculiar to disjunction. If, then, it be proved that this particular tone does not alter with variation of genus, evidently the change can affect only the parts of the fourth. Now, the lower of the notes containing the tone is the higher of the notes containing the lower of the disjunct tetrachords. As such, we have seen that it is immovable in the changes of the genera. Again, the higher of the notes bounding the tone is the lower of the notes bounding the higher of the disjunct tetrachords. It likewise, as we have seen, remains constant through change of genus. Since, therefore, it appears that the notes containing the tone do not vary with a change of genus. The necessary conclusion is that it is only the parts of the fourth that participate in that change. Every genus comprises at most as many simple intervals as are contained in the fifth. The scale of every genus, as we have already stated, takes the form of conjunction or disjunction. Now, it has been shown that the conjunct scale consists merely of the parts of the fourth, while the disjunct scale adds a single interval peculiar to itself, namely the tone. But the addition of this tone to the parts of the fourth completes the interval of the fifth. Since, therefore, it appears that no scale of any genus taken in the one shading is composed of more simple intervals than those in the fifth, it follows that every genus comprises at most as many simple intervals as are contained in the fifth. In this proposition, the addition of the words at the most sometimes proves a stumbling block. Why not, it's asked, show without qualification that each genus is composed of as many simple intervals as are contained in the fifth? The answer to this is that in certain circumstances each of the genera will comprise fewer intervals than exist in the fifth, but never will comprise more. This is the reason that we prove first that no genus can be constituted of more simple intervals than there are in the fifth. That every genus will sometimes be composed of fewer is shown in the sequel. A pycnum cannot be followed by a pycnum or by part of a pycnum. For the result of such a succession will be that neither the fourth notes in order from one another will form fourths, nor the fifth notes in order from one another fifths. But we have already seen that such an order of notes is unmelodious. The lower of the notes containing the ditone is the highest note of a pycnum, and the higher of the notes containing the ditone is the lowest note of a pycnum. For as the pycna in conjunct tetrachords form fourths with one another, the ditone must lie between them. Similarly, since the ditones form fourths with one another, the pycnum must lie between them. It follows that the pycnum and the ditone must succeed one another alternately. Therefore, it is evident that of the notes containing the ditone, the lower will be the highest note of the pycnum below, and the higher will be the lowest note of the pycnum above. The notes containing the tone are both the lowest notes of a pycnum. For in disjunction, the tone is placed between tetrachords, the boundaries of which are the lowest notes of a pycnum, and it is by these notes that the tone is contained. For the lower of the notes containing the tone is the higher of those containing the lower tetrachord, and the higher of those containing the tone is the lower of those containing the higher tetrachord. Therefore, it is evident that the notes containing the tone will be the lowest notes of a pycnum. A succession of two ditones is forbidden. Suppose such a succession, then the higher ditone will be followed by a pycnum below, and the lower ditone will be followed by a pictum above, for we saw that the note that forms the upper boundary of the ditone is the lowest note of a pictum. The result will be a succession of 2 picna, and as this has been proved unmelodious, the succession of 2 ditones must equally be so. In enharmonic and chromatic scales, a succession of 2 tones is not allowed. Suppose a succession first in the ascending scale. Now, if that note that forms the upper boundary of the added tone is musically correct, it must form either a fourth with the 4th note in order from it, or a 5th with the 5th in order. If neither of these conditions is satisfied, it must be unmelodious. But that neither of them will be satisfied is clear, for if it be enharmonic, the licanus, which is the 4th note in order from the added note, will be 4 tones removed from it. If it be chromatic, whether of the soft or hemiolic color, the licanus will be further removed than a 5th, and if it be of the tonic chromatic, the licanus will form a 5th with the added note. But this does not satisfy our law, which demands that either the 4th note should form a 4th or the 5th a 5th. Neither condition is here fulfilled. It follows that the note constituting the upper boundary of the added tone will be unmelodious. Again, if the second tone be added below, it will render the genus diatonic. Therefore, it is evident that in the enharmonic and chromatic genera, a succession of 2 tones is impossible. In the diatonic genus, 3 consecutive tones are permitted, but no more. For let the contrary be supposed, then the note bounding the 4th tone will not form a 4th with the 4th note from it, nor a 5th with the 5th. In the same genus, a succession of 2 semitones is not allowed. For first suppose the second semitone to be added below the semitone already present. The result is that the note bounding the added semitone neither makes a 4th with the 4th note from it, nor a 5th with the 5th. The introduction then of the semitone here will be unmelodious. But if it be added above the semitone already present, the genus will be chromatic. Thus it is clear that in a diatonic scale the succession of 2 semitones is impossible. It has now been shown which of the simple intervals can be repeated in intermediate succession, and how often they can be repeated, and which of them, on the contrary, it is absolutely impossible to repeat at all. We shall now speak of the collocation of unequal intervals. A diatone may be succeeded either above or below by a pictum. For it has been proved that in conjunct tetrachords these intervals follow alternately. Therefore, each can succeed the other either in an ascending or descending order. A ditone can be followed by a tone in the ascending scale only. For suppose such a succession in the descending order. The result will be that the highest and the lowest note of a pictum will fall on the same pitch, for we saw that the note that forms the lower boundary of the ditone was the highest note of a pictum, and that the note that forms the upper boundary of the tone was the lowest note of a pictum. But if these notes fall on the one pitch, it follows that there is a succession of 2 picna. As this latter succession is unmelodious, a tone immediately below a ditone must be equally so. A tone can be followed by a pictum in the descending order only. For suppose such a succession in the opposite order, the same impossibility will be found to result again. The highest and lowest note of a pictum will fall on the same pitch, and consequently there will be a succession of 2 picna, this latter being unmelodious. The position of the tone above the pictum must equally be so. In the diatonic genus, a tone cannot be both preceded and succeeded by a semitone, for the consequence would be that neither the 4th notes in order from one another would form a 4th, nor the 5th a 5th. A pair of tones, or a group of 3 tones, may be both preceded and succeeded by a semitone, for either the 4th notes from one another will form a 4th, or the 5th a 5th. From the ditone there are 2 possible progressions, upwards, 1 only downwards. For it has been proved that the ditone can be followed in the ascending scale by either a pictum or a tone, but more progressions upwards from the said interval there cannot be, for the only other simple interval left is the ditone, and the two consecutive ditones are forbidden. In the descending order there is but one progression from the ditone, for it has been proved that a ditone cannot lie next a ditone, and that a tone cannot succeed a ditone in the descending order. Consequently, the progression to the pycnum alone remains. It is clear, then, that from the ditone there are two possible progressions, upwards, one to the tone, and one to the pycnum, and one possible progression downwards, to the pycnum. From the pycnum, on the contrary, there are two possible progressions, downwards and one upwards. For it has been proved that in the descending scale a pycnum can be followed by a ditone or a tone. A third progression there cannot be, for the only remaining simple interval is the pycnum, and a succession of two pycna is forbidden. It follows that there are only two possible progressions from a pycnum downwards. Upwards there is but one, to the ditone, for a pycnum cannot adjoin a pycnum, nor can a tone succeed the pycnum in the ascending scale. Therefore the ditone alone remains. It is evident, then, that from the pycnum there are two possible progressions, downwards, one to the tone, and one to the ditone, and one possible progression upwards, to the ditone. From the tone there is but one progression in either direction, downwards to the ditone, upwards to the pycnum. It has been shown that in the descending scale the tone cannot be followed by a tone or by a pycnum. Therefore the ditone alone remains, and it has been shown that in the ascending scale the tone cannot be followed by a tone or a ditone. Therefore the pycnum alone remains. It follows that from the tone there is but one possible progression in either direction, downwards to the ditone and upwards to the pycnum. The same law can be applied to the chromatic scales, except, of course, that one must substitute for the ditone the interval between the messe and lecanus, which varies according to the particular shade, with the size of the pycnum. The same law will also hold good of the diatonic scales. From the tone common to the genera there is one possible progression in either direction, downwards to the interval between the messe and lecanus, whatever it may happen to be in any particular shade of the diatonic scales, upwards to the interval between the paramesse and trite. Some persons have been much perplexed by this proposition. They are surprised that we do not arrive at quite a contrary conclusion, for they think that the progressions in either direction from the tone are innumerable, since there are innumerable possible magnitudes of the interval between the messe and the lecanus, and of the pycnum as well. To this objection we offer the following answer. To begin with, the same observation might be made equally well in the other cases we have considered. Evidently, one of the two descending progressions from the pycnum admits of innumerable possible magnitudes. Likewise, one of the two ascending progressions from the ditone. For such an interval as that between the messe and the lecanus admits of innumerable magnitudes, and the same may be said of such an interval as the pycnum. Nevertheless, there are but two progressions from the pycnum downwards and two from the ditone upwards, and similarly, one from the tone in either direction. For the progressions must be ascertained in accordance with one individual shade in one particular genus. In making any musical phenomenon the object of scientific knowledge, its definite side should be insisted on, its indefinite features left in the background. Now, in respect of the sizes of intervals and the pitch of notes, the phenomenon of melody are indefinite, while in respect of functions, common qualities, and orders of arrangement, they are definite and determined. To take the first example that occurs, the progression downwards from the pycnum are in function and character determined as 2 in number. The first proceeds by the tone and brings the scale into the disjunct class. The second, proceeding by the other interval, whatever its size may be, brings the scale into the conjunct class. Hence we see also that there is but one possible progression in either direction from the tone, and that both these progressions alike produce but one class of scale, the disjunct. But it is quite plain from these observations and from the nature of the facts that if one seeks to discover the possible progressions by considering not one shade of one genus at a time, but all shades and all genera together, one will come upon an infinity of them. In the chromatic and enharmonic scales, every note participates in the pycnon. For every note in the said genera is the boundary either of a part of the pycnon, or of the tone, or of an interval such as that between the messe and licanus. The case of notes that bound the parts of the pycnon requires no proof. It is immediately evident that they participate in the pycnon. And we proved already that the notes containing the tone are both the lowest notes of a pycnon. We showed also the lower of the notes containing the remaining interval was the highest of a pycnon, and the higher of them the lowest of a pycnon. Now, as these are the only simple intervals, and each of them is contained by notes both of which participate in the pycnon, it follows that every note in the chromatic and enharmonic genus participates in the pycnon. One will readily see that the positions of the notes situated in the pycnon are 3 in number, since, as we know, a pycnon cannot be followed by another pycnon, or part of one, for it is evident in consequence of this latter law that the number of the said notes is so limited. It is required to prove that from the lowest only of the notes in a pycnon there are 2 possible progressions in either direction, while from the others there is but one. It has already been proved that from the pycnon there are 2 progressions downwards, one to the tone and one to the ditone. But to prove that there are 2 progressions downwards from the pycnon is the same as proving that there are 2 progressions downwards from the lowest of the notes situated in the pycnon. For this note marks the upper boundary of the ditone. But it is clear that the same note which forms the upper boundary of the ditone also forms the lower boundary of the pycnon, being the lowest note of a pycnon, for this too was proved. Hence it is evident that from this note there are 2 possible progressions in either direction. It is required to prove that from the highest note of a pycnon there is but one progression in either direction. It was proved that from a pycnon there is but one progression upwards, but to say that there is one progression upwards from the pycnon is, for the reason given in the former proposition, the same as saying that there is but one from the note limiting it. Again, it was proved that from the ditone there is but one progression downwards, but to say that there is but one progression downwards from the ditone is, for the reason given, the same as saying that there is but one from the note bounding it. But it is evident that the note which bounds the ditone below is at the same time the upper boundary of the pycnon, being the highest note of a pycnon. It is plain then that from the given note there is but one possible progression in either direction. It is required to prove that from the middle note of a pycnon there is but one progression in either direction. Now, since the given note must be adjoined by some one or other of the 3 simple intervals, and there lies already a dices on each side of it, plainly it cannot be adjoined on either side by either a ditone or a tone. For suppose a ditone to adjoin it, then either the lowest or the highest note of a pycnon will fall on the same pitch as the given note, which is the middle note of a pycnon. Consequently, there will be a succession of 3 dices, no matter on which side the ditone will be located. Again, suppose a tone to adjoin the given note. We shall have the same result. The lowest note of a pycnon will fall on the same pitch as the middle note of a pycnon, so that we shall have, again, 3 dices in succession. But this succession is unmelodious. Therefore, it follows that there is but one possible progression from the given note in either direction. It has now been shown that from the lowest of the notes of a pycnon there are 2 possible progressions in either direction, while from the others in either direction there is but one. It is required to prove that 2 notes that occupy dissimilar positions in the pycnon cannot fall on the same pitch without violating the nature of melody. Suppose, firstly, that the highest and lowest note of a pycnon fall on the same pitch. The result will be 2 consecutive pycna. And as this is unmelodious, it must be equally unmelodious that notes dissimilar in the pycnon in the manner of the assumed notes should fall upon the same pitch. Again, it is evident that the notes also that are dissimilar in the other possible manner cannot have a common pitch. For if the highest or lowest note of a pycnum coincide in pitch with a middle note, there necessarily results a succession of 3 dices. It is required to prove that the diatonic genus is composed of 2 or 3 or of 4 simple quanta. It has been already shown that each genus comprises at most as many simple intervals as there are in the fifth. These are 4 in number. If then 3 of those 4 become equal, leaving but one odd, as happens in the sharp diatonic, there will only be 2 different quanta in the diatonic scale. Again, if 2 become equal and 2 remain unequal, which will result from the lowering of the peripatae, there will be 3 quanta constituting the diatonic scale, namely an interval less than a semitone, a tone, and an interval greater than a tone. Again, if all the parts of the fifth become unequal, there will be 4 quanta comprised in the genus in question. It is clear then that the diatonic genus is composed of 2 or of 3 or of 4 simple quanta. It is required to prove that the chromatic and enharmonic genera are composed of 3 or 4 simple quanta. The simple intervals of the fifth being 4 in number, if the parts of the pycnum are equal, the genera in question will comprise those quanta, namely the half of the pycnum, whatever its size may be, the tone and interval such as that between the messe and licanus. If, on the other hand, the parts of the pycnum are unequal, the said genera will be composed of 4 quanta, the least an interval such as that between the hypatae and the peripatae, the next smallest one such as that between the peripatae and licanus, the third smallest a tone, and the largest an interval such as that between the messe and licanus. On this point the difficulty has been raised. How is it that all the genera cannot be composed of 2 simple quanta, as is the case with the diatonic? We can now see that the complete and obvious explanation of the difference. 3 equal simple intervals cannot occur in succession in the enharmonic and chromatic genera. In the diatonic they can. That is the reason that the last named genus is sometimes composed of only 2 simple quanta. Passing from this subject, we shall proceed to consider the meaning and nature of different species. We shall use the term species and figure indifferently, applying both to the same phenomenon. Such a difference arises when the order of the simple parts of a certain whole is altered, while both the number and magnitude of those parts remain the same. Proceeding from this definition, we have to show that there are 3 species of the fourth. Firstly, there is that in which the pycnum lies at the bottom. Secondly, that in which a dices lies on each side of the ditone. Thirdly, that in which the pycnum is above the ditone. It will be readily seen that there are no other possible relative positions of the parts of the fourth. End of Book 3. End of The Elements of Harmony by Aristoxenus. Translated by Henry Macron. Published in the Clarendon Press, 1902.